Thank you for your patience and cooperation. Boarding will begin in a few moments.
Hello YouTube, and welcome, Phriq here, and I've got another Let's Learn Flight Simulator X video for you today. Today we're going to be doing a cold and dark startup through takeoff of the Carenado Cessna 152. Now if you've seen any of my previous Let's Learn videos, you know I've done the cold and dark startup in both the Carenado and default versions of the Cessna 172. However, I am making this video and the future ones in correlation with my other series, which is Let's Play Flight Simulator X FS Passengers, where I'm going to be flying a various number of aircraft, and I'm starting small with the Cessna 152 because I want to give a good baseline for aviation. The Cessna 152 is a very basic aircraft, and you can't get much more basic unless you start heading into the ultralight aircraft. So I'm going to start with the Cessna 152, we'll work our way up through some Pipers, Cessna 172, 182, and maybe go into like a TBM 850 or some of the Beechcraft aircraft. But in order to get there, let's get a good foundation. So that's why we are starting with the basics, because once you learn the basic switches and lights and all that on the smaller aircraft, you can start to transition to more complex aircraft. With that being said, let's hop into our aircraft, and as you can see, it is pretty beautifully modeled. Carenado does an excellent job. I love how they model their aircraft. For the most part, most things inside the cockpit are interactable, which I also enjoy. You can also remove the yokes in them, so that is very beneficial. Now you can see the entire avionics and the whole panel, so you can get to those switches without having to do wonky camera movements and things like that, so you can actually see what they are. Also, for this checklist, I am not going to be using the Carenado Cessna 152 checklist, as, in my opinion, it's just kind of thin. So with that being said, I scoured the internet, I looked at tons of different checklists, and I decided to just go on this wayman.net one that I found. I'll put the link in the description, but it seems to have pretty much everything that we need for this aircraft. There are a few things missing, and there's also a few things added that are not relevant to this version of the aircraft, but every aircraft can be different. They might have different avionics packages. You might even put like G1000s, probably not in a Cessna 152, but hey, I don't know your life. I know they have them in 172, so why not? Some of this stuff will be relevant and irrelevant, and I'll try to point that out. I will have the link in the description, so if you want to follow along with the checklist, definitely pull it up, and hopefully it'll be beneficial to you. Also, I am not going to be doing this initial exterior summary interior. Most of that is the walk around or looking at the forms and things like that, which are not going to be relevant to Flight Simulator X. You can, calculate takeoff weights and things like that, but the game is not designed to do a walk around, so maybe later in the future I'll try to simulate a walk around in Flight Simulator X just so you can kind of see what those checklist steps are about. But for all intents and purposes of this video, we are going to start with the start checklist, go through the pre-taxi, run up, pre-takeoff, and takeoff. We are not going to be doing anything past that, so once you're airborne, sorry guys, you are on your own. However, the climb, cruise, descent, pre-landing, landing, after landing, securing checklists are all fairly self-explanatory. And if you do want to get some idea on how those are run, watch some of my other Let's Play Flight Simulator X FS Passenger videos, because I run through the checklists in those as well. Now I'm going to get that checklist out of the way, and let's get into this aircraft. So the first thing is the start up checklist. So seat, track, back, and lock, which again we can't do because this is a video game. Avionics. Now here's where the first gotcha comes, because in the Carenado version of the Cessna 152, I can't find a master switch for the avionics. I have looked everywhere. I have looked through the internet. I can't find it anywhere. So I have eventually just ended up mapping it to one of the buttons on my throttle quadrant. So if you can find where that master switch is, let me know, because I have tried pressing every single button that I can find everywhere, and I'm just not finding it on this aircraft. But that needs to be in the off position. Next is carb heat. Carb heat is right here, carburetor heat. You want to have that pushed in to be cold, otherwise you can see pull for on. So if you pull it out, that is going to be on or hot. But right now for the startup, we're going to have that cold. Next, we can turn the beacon on. The beacon light is right here. You'll also notice while we're down here, if I zoom in a little more, that the strobe light, the taxi light, and the pitot heat are not in this version of the aircraft. So you will see in this checklist it calling for turning on the taxi light or the strobe light or the pitot heat. Unfortunately, they are not in this version of the aircraft. You'll also see that we do have a dome light and a panel light that we can turn on, but it's nighttime, but it's daytime, excuse me, so I'm going to be turning that off. Also, some other gotchas with this is here's where the fuses would lay, but unfortunately in the Carenado version and a lot of aircraft I have seen in Flight Simulator X, the fuses just don't work because what are we going to replace them with? I mean, you're not going to take out fuses unless you're maybe diagnosing an in-flight emergency. Outside of that, it's probably not going to happen. So those are a few gotchas with this aircraft. Anyway, we have our beacon on. Next, we can go to mixture full rich. So I'll look down and you can see the mixture is the red one right here. And we're going to pull that all the way in, or push that all the way in, which is the full rich position. Throttle, we're going to crack that slightly. It's usually about 1/4 of an inch. Why it's bouncing back and forth so much, I have no idea, but we pushed it in about 1/4 of an inch, so it is slightly in. Now we can prime this aircraft. It's usually about 3 strokes to prime that, and we should be good with that. We can check the brakes to make sure they're on. Normally it should be pulled out for parking brakes and pushed in for them off, I believe. However, it toggles in this version of the Cessna 152, so just look down here in the bottom left-hand corner. You'll see it says parking brakes to signify that they are on. Otherwise, if you don't want to use the button, you could use period, which is the hotkey, to toggle your brakes on and off, or your parking brakes. We want to check that the prop area is clear, so we're going to be looking around. There's a plane to our left, plane to our right, and I'm not seeing anybody behind us, so it looks clear, so we are all good to start cranking. We can turn our master switch on. Our battery master switch is what they're referring to. There is the alternator one. We could turn that on now. It's not going to hurt the aircraft, but I usually like to turn that on once I have good engine start. And that is something that is not listed in this checklist. Now we can go to mags to the start position, or the magnetos. Now once we do this, we're going to kind of have a flow of things that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at a climb in the RPM on the tachometer. We're going to be looking for increased oil pressure. We're going to be looking at an increasing oil temperature. And then over here, you can see right now on our amperes that we are actually draining about 7 amps on the battery load. And then once we turn on our alternator switch after engine start, that should climb to the positive and eventually settle at 0 once the batteries are fully charged. So that's kind of a flow that we're going to be looking for once we start up this aircraft. So we will go and turn our magnetos to the start position. As you can see, the RPM is starting to increase. We can also see that our oil pressure is coming alive and that our oil temperature is slowly rising. Another thing in this checklist that is not there, that should be there, is once you get good engine start, everything is running fine, you want to pull back your throttle till you're sitting at about 1,000 RPM. It's not quite full idle. You want to be a little more in than idle just to let the engine warm up, so you try to sit it around 1,000 RPM. The next thing we can do is lights as required. So we could turn on our nav lights at this point, and then we'll turn on our landing lights a little later. And then mixture as required. We are full rich. I'm only at about 900 feet elevation here in Fargo, North Dakota. If I was taking off from, say, someplace in Colorado where the elevation might be 6,000, 7,000 feet, I might lean back that mixture a little bit just to get a little more efficiency with my engine. That completes the startup checklist, so we're going to go into the pre-taxi taxi checklist. And before I do that, one thing I should say about the prop clear part in the start checklist is another thing you're going to want to do is call that you're starting the engine. So even though you visually looked around, make an all clear sound. Prop clear, so that way they know that you are going to be starting the engine. It's also a good habit to try to find out where the nearest fire extinguisher is, just in case there is any issues with the engine start. All right, now I swear we're gonna go into the pre-taxi taxi checklist. So seatbelt harnesses, we gotta fasten those. Unfortunately, we can't. Here's where the flaps, we wanna make sure they are up, which they are, but I'm also gonna turn on this alternator, which is not in this checklist. Now you can see that the battery level is at 0.08 amps, so it's actually charging the batteries right now, and then eventually as they get charged, you can see that already dropping to 0.7. That'll settle at 0 once the batteries are charged. So we know our alternator is working. Flaps are up. Heat vent defrost at this point. Now that we have the engine running, we could turn on cabin air, we could turn on cabin heat, and then we also have this vent up here. Normally I'm going to keep this vent open just because it gets some fresh air from the outside inside of the cabin. Avionics, we can turn those on and we can go ahead and set them. So we can turn on our transponder to 1200 and then put that to standby, which is the next checklist point after this avionics on and set, is putting the transponder to standby. If we were going to be using the ADF, we could set that, and or if we were going to be using VORs or something, we could start setting up our nav frequencies. However, I am not going to be using them. This is going to be a strictly VFR flight. If you want to know VOR navigation, I do have a Let's Learn video for that. Once we have the transponder set, avionics set, we can go ahead and open our ATC menu. I'm going to be doing this simply for simplicity, as the buttons on this avionics package are a little difficult to use sometimes. If I put my cursor right on it, I can't toggle the frequency. I have to actually put it a little off to the side. So it's just a little frustrating because of that, and for speed, I'm going to tune to Fargo Addons through the ATC menu.
Altimeter 29902, ILS, runway 36 in use, landing and departing, runway 36, VFR aircraft, say direction of flight. All aircraft read back, hold short instructions. Advise controller on initial contact, you have Mike.
Alright guys, so we have Mike. I'm going to get rid of that ATC window for right now. They said the altimeter was 29902. I don't have my weather engine on right now for real world weather. It's super windy out today, so I wouldn't even be starting my aircraft. But if we needed to change the altimeter, here's where you do it. You can see your altitude is displayed here is showing about 900 feet, which is true for North Dakota, especially Fargo where we are taking off from. And then you can see that 29902 is displayed in there, and then if you hold down here where you actually adjust by spinning this knob, that's where you change your altimeter. So we're going to change it back to 29902. We're going to be taking off on runway 36 using Gulf taxiway to get there, and we can go back into our checklist. So radio test is the next step. We know that we're able to receive because we heard Addons, and right after this I'm going to be calling ground, so I'm not going to be testing. However, if we really wanted to, we could tune to Fargo ground and say Fargo ground November 625 Delta Lima radio check, and they'll just come back with loud and clear or 5x5 or, you know, whatever it is. Weak and unreadable. So that's how you would do a radio check. Taxi lights, we could turn those on if we have them, but we do not in this model. Brakes, we can test attitude indicator test, turn coordinator test, and also heading indicator and compass test. So that's all going to be a flow once we actually start our taxi. So what are we going to do for that? Brakes, we're going to test both of the brakes, and then we can test the differential braking. We can test the left brake and also the right brake to see if both of them are functioning and as they should. Attitude indicator, we can check to make sure that everything is working, that it's displaying turns and things like that. We can look at our turn coordinator, make sure that that is showing that we are turning, that the ball is moving, and we can also look at our heading indicator, which is down here, make sure that is moving in relationship to our new directions as we're in a turn with our taxi, and also compare it to our magnetic compass, which is up here. Just one thing with the magnetic compass, when you're in flight and start to turn, it usually tends to turn the wrong way initially, and then it'll start to catch up. Just one thing to be aware of when you're actually flying. So those are some things we're going to do on our taxi. So let's get our taxi clearance to request departure to the west.
Target Delta Lima with Mike. Request taxi for takeoff, west departure.
November 625, Delta Lima taxi to and hold short of runway 36 using taxiway golf. Contact tower on 133.8 when ready.
Taxi 2 and hold short runway 36 via taxiway golf.
All right, so we got our taxiway instructions. We are going to be going to runway 36 via Gulf. So we can start our taxi right now. I'm going to get rid of this ATC menu, and I am going to slowly start putting in some throttle and taking off the parking brake, and we should start moving. I'm going to look both to my right and to my left and make sure that we can actually do a turn, and I'm going to be turning to the left because that's a slightly further away aircraft. As you see, we are in the turn. We can see our magnetic compass shifting. We can also see our heading indicator shifting. We can see that our ball is over to the right and that we are showing a left turn. So all of those are checking, which is good. Here I just hit both of my brakes and we can see that both brakes are working. If I start giving myself a little throttle, I can check them differentially by hitting my left brake. I turn a little to the left, and then I can push the right brake, turn a little to the right. So I know that my brakes are working. Now we just have a little bit of a taxi ahead of us. We got to go around this aircraft and come over to the taxiway over here. And this one is also wanting to go. So I am going to let him pass quick, and I will bring you all back in just a little bit. Alright everybody, I am back. That Dash 8 is further down the taxiway so we can start our taxi. Being a good steward of aviation, you want to make sure you check both directions just to make sure the taxiway is clear for the purposes of, say, a Dash 8 cutting in front of you even though you had clearance to taxi. Gonna give myself a little bit of a throttle, put it in about a quarter of the way, and then maybe pull it back some. Push it in maybe a little more than you need to actually taxi just so you can get going, but once you have that airspeed, you're probably gonna wanna pull that back a little bit and then follow the taxiway. Going a little faster than I should be, but I just wanna get us to the place where we're going to be doing our run-up. Start our turn here, and I'm actually going to cut the corner here. So the taxiway actually has you come down here and then wrap around over here to get onto Gulf, but I am just going to be cutting the corner for time purposes. Be advised, in real life I would not do that, but for time's sake I am going to cut the corner. Another thing while we're taxiing, so we have our runway 3113 right up here. One thing to note is the game doesn't give you clearances to pass inactive runways. I could stop at the hold short line here and I wouldn't get any kind of information in my ATC menu telling me to proceed. I would just be stuck there. So if it's an inactive runway in this game, you can just proceed. If you want to be a good steward of aviation, as always, look both ways, make sure there are no aircraft coming in on the inactive runway, but I think we should be all right. Normally in real life though, you would stop at the hold short line and or they would give you clearance to proceed directly past that runway that is there. So a little difference between Flight Simulator X and the real world. So the Dash 8 right now is at the hold short line for runway 36. He should be getting clearance any second to start heading up. Here's the hold short line for going the other way on that other runway, but what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn us this way to the north and hit the brakes. Now because that Dash 8 is here, I am doing this here. Normally I would have probably held even further back. I wouldn't have tried to cross this runway. And definitely if he was not there, I'd be crossing this hold short line and doing my run up in between both of these hold short lines. Now I'm going to simulate that we have northerly winds. That's why I turned the aircraft to the north. We're taking off on runway 36, so we would assume that the winds are coming from the north. So you want to turn your aircraft when you do the run-up to the direction of the winds to help stabilize you while you do this. So the run-up checklist, let's go ahead and do that. So parking brake, we are going to set that. Fuel, we want to make sure is on. We don't have a fuel selector switch in this version of the aircraft. Trim, we want to set that for takeoff, which is right here, so you can see that I can move that for takeoff. Where are we in the checklist? Flight controls, here's where we can check if they are free and correct. So in order to do that, you can push in, pull out on the yoke, turn it, and also move your rudder pedals. Now when you're doing that, it's good to look outside. So if I push my yoke in, you'll see the elevator go down. If I pull it out, you'll see it come up. If I move my rudder pedals, you can see the rudder going. Also, if I look, man, I'm terrible with these cameras. If I look out my wing and turn left and right, you will see those ailerons moving. So that's how you know that your flight controls are free and correct. Instruments, they have another thing to set it, so if I am using nav frequencies or VORs or anything like that, I could go ahead and set those all right now. Mixture, best power. Best power right now is full forward or full rich for me right now, as I'm only at 900 feet elevation. That might be leaned a little if you are higher in altitude. Primer, we want to make sure that that is in and locked. That is down here. Normally, I believe you can twist it clockwise to lock it into position because you don't want to accidentally prime your engine while you're in flight because that could cause it to stall. And then we're going to start testing our magnetos and our carb heat. In order to do that, we need to bump up our power to 1700 RPM, which you can see it coming up right now. Making sure that your parking brake is set and that you're not crawling forward. Once it is at around 1700 RPM, what I can do is I can go down to my left magneto and we'll see a little dip in that RPM. If I go to both, we will see that increase again. And then if we go to the right magneto, you will see it dip again. It's usually by about 50 RPM for both of those. Now once we do our carb heat, if we pull this out, we're gonna see a decrease of the RPM, and it's usually around 100 to 150. It's a little more power that is needed for the carb heat, and that's why you lose some of that RPM. So we can see that that is working, turn it off, and we can see that it is going back up. Vacuum, we can check our vacuum gauge, which is right here, just making sure that we have good suction. We can check our power usage again, and we can see that the battery load is at 0 amps. Oil pressure, we can check that again. We are in the green, and oil temperature, making sure we're not getting too hot, and we're only at 168, so we are good. Next, let's pull our throttle back to idle, and we'll want to make sure that the aircraft doesn't shut off or do anything crazy like that, and that it's able to sustain idle. Throttle friction is another thing that we could adjust. That is normally right here. Again, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, just like a screw. And that adjusts how much power it needs to push it in and out. With that, our run-up is complete, so we're ready for the pre-takeoff checklist. I am going to turn off my parking brakes, and I'm going to taxi us back to the hold short line. And while we do that, we can start going through our pre-takeoff checklist. So the first step is flaps 10%. So I'm going to lower them one notch, and they should be at that 10%. Mixture, again, best power. We're going to be using full throttle for this because, or full mixture, full rich, because we are only at 900 feet. Again, you would lean that if you're at a higher altitude. Carb heat, off as required. I have that off because it's a nice warm day. Parking brake I'm turning on one last time while we do this remainder of the checklist. Pitot heat, we could go ahead and turn that on if you had that. That is right here. And then heading indicator to compass. We want to make sure that they are basically aligned. So right here I'm showing a 266 heading, just slightly off west. And if I look up at my compass, it's showing the exact same thing. So I know that both of those are working and aligned. Doors and windows, we want to make sure those are closed. Transponder, we can go ahead and turn this to the on position. Landing light, we can go ahead and also put that on as well, which is right there. Strobes, if we had them, we could turn those on, however we do not. Now, time note. Why are you going to note the time? Well, you want to know when you take off, you want to know when you land, but then you also want to know, in case you're flying VFR, when to start your clock for your checkpoints that you're going to be using, your visual references that you will time in between for your flight to make sure that you are on course. Once all that is completed, we can tune to Fargo Tower and get clearance for takeoff runway 36.
Fargo Tower, November 625 Delta Lima, ready for west departure at runway 36. November 625 Delta Lima, clear for takeoff, runway 36 west departure, approved.
All right, so we'll acknowledge that clearance and then get rid of that menu. And I turned off parking brake. We can start getting onto the runway. Make sure you look both ways again to make sure that no aircraft are on or coming at you, and then we can start our taxi onto runway 36. The takeoff checklist now is pretty simple. It's full throttle. We want to make sure that we have a minimum of 2,280 RPM. Oil pressure, make sure that it's all green, rotate at around 50 knots, and then a VY of 67. Then we can put our flaps up. One other thing it says in the checklist is an abort plan. You always want to have a passenger brief on what you're planning on doing, as well as for yourself. So just say we have an engine failure when we're on our takeoff roll. At what point are we going to rotate? At what point are we going to try to abort? For me, in this smaller aircraft, if I have more than half the runway, I am absolutely going to abort even if I'm airborne, just because I should definitely have enough runway to land and be safe. It's not a very fast aircraft. However, if I'm at the departure end of the runway and the engine goes out, I'm going to be looking for a nice sheet of grass somewhere on the other side. So that's just the nature of the beast when it comes to these. So those are something that you want to look at. Do you have an abort speed? Do you have an abort location on the runway as to where you're going to put it down if you are already airborne? With that being said, let's go and take off. So we're going to put full throttle. The aircraft is going to have a tendency to want to turn to the left, and that is because of the P factor and torque, so you just got to use a little right rudder to try to maintain center line. While I'm doing that, I'm looking at my RPM. I'm also looking at my airspeed down here, making sure that both things are looking good. I can also look down and look at my pressures. They're looking good. We're above 50 knots. I can go ahead and rotate. As you can see, we are slowly climbing. We got a good rate of climb. I don't want to climb too high because I don't want to stall the aircraft. That's a danger. So I'm going to be looking at my airspeed closely. Also, I'm going to be trying to fly my north heading of 360 until I get to the departure end of the runway. Once we are good, climbed, and in the air, I'm going to put my flaps up, which were down here, and that was that sound that you heard, and you should see the airspeed slowly start to decrease, or increase, excuse me. However, your initial climb will decrease some with that. And with that, everybody, we have taken off and done all the checklists from the cold and dark position of the Cessna 152 by Carenado. I hope you enjoyed this video. If I missed something or if there's something that you want to discuss further, definitely throw me a comment or send me a message. Also, please subscribe to the channel. Seeing those happy subscribers is what makes me motivated to do more of this. Also, be sure to ring that notification bell so next time I make another Let's Learn video and or I make any other videos, whether that be Let's Learn or Flight Simulator X FS Passengers or I Bought Too Many Games, you will see that video is there and you can check it out right away. So please do those things, and thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all next time.